Not today, monster.
Betrayal tastes like copper and hot sand. Jack Chung, the Ashen King of Seoul, was face down in a furnace. His $10,000 charcoal suit wasn't a symbol of power anymore. It was a body bag. Every breath felt like inhaling ground glass. To his left, his encrypted phone lay smashed, a jagged shard reflecting a sun that wanted him dead. It wasn't a rival's bullet that dropped him. It was a brother's hand. Mark Giordani's smirk was burned into Jack's retinas, sharper than the midday glare. 10 years of loyalty erased by a single gear shift as the SUV roared away, leaving Jack to be digested by the dunes. Then the air vibrated. A guttural mechanical growl. A rusted pickup slammed to a halt, kicking up a blinding screen of grit. The door groaned open. A woman stepped out, silhouetted against the white-hot sky. She didn't look like a victim. She looked like the Reaper. She saw the dragon tattoos coiling around his throat, marks that usually turned men to stone, and she didn't flinch. She knelt, pressed a cold flask to his cracked lips, and whispered a lie he almost believed. Not today, monster. The heat was a physical assault, a weight that pressed Jack's face deeper into the blistering orange grit. Every second felt like an eternity under the white eye of the sun. He tried to move, but his muscles were fused by dehydration. His mind, however, refused to stay silent. It dragged him back to the air-conditioned silence of the sedan just 3 hours ago. The betrayal replayed in high-definition loops. Mark Giordani had sat to his right, smelling of expensive cologne and cold ambition. Jack remembered the subtle vibration of the car as it veered off the paved road. He remembered reaching for his weapon, only to find an empty holster and Mark's hand clamping down on his wrist like a steel trap. "The city doesn't need a statue, Jack," Mark had whispered, his voice devoid of a decade's worth of shared blood. "It needs a heartbeat, and yours is slowing down." The memory of that smirk, sharp, surgical, and triumphant, was the only thing keeping Jack's heart beating now. He watched the mirage of the city's skyline shimmer in the distance, a shimmering lie of glass and concrete that no longer belonged to him. Mark was likely already sitting in his chair, drinking his scotch and signing away the docks to the highest bidder. The thought burned hotter than the sand. He was the Ashen King, a man who had built a throne on ironclad loyalty, yet he had been dethroned by a ghost of his own making. He clawed at the sand, his fingernails cracking against the hard-packed earth. The desert wind howled, mocking his status. In the city, he was a god. Here, he was just carbon and meat waiting to be reclaimed by the dunes. Hate was the only fuel left in his scorched lungs. "Not like this," he wheezed, the grit scratching his throat. "Not for you, Mark." The rusted door of the pickup truck didn't just open. It shrieked, a metallic warning that sliced through the desert's oppressive silence. Helen Samuel stepped onto the scorched earth, her boots sinking into the fine orange silt. She didn't rush. In this wasteland, haste was a death sentence. She kept her eyes fixed on the man in the charcoal suit, her hand hovering near the shotgun holstered against the driver's seat. He looked like a fallen monument, a relic of a city that had chewed him up and spat him out. As she drew closer, the coiled dragon tattoos on his throat came into focus. They were marks of a predator, a warning sign that any sane person would have heeded by floorboarding the gas. Helen stopped 3 feet away, her shadow falling over Jack's scorched face. She saw the ruined silk of his shirt and the jagged laceration that mapped his betrayal. He was a monster, clearly. But even monsters bled out at the same rate as men. Her jaw tightened, the crow's feet around her eyes deepening as she squinted against the white-hot glare. This was a complication she didn't need. Her orchard was a sanctuary of silence, and this man brought the loud, violent stench of the underworld with him. "You're a long way from the high-rises, aren't you?" she muttered, her voice a low rasp. Jack's eyes fluttered, bloodshot and glazed with fever, but he didn't speak. He couldn't. His pride was buried under layers of grit. Helen looked at the horizon, searching for the dust clouds of whoever had left him here. Nothing but shimmering heat waves. She cursed under her breath, reached down and hooked her calloused arms under his. He was dead weight, a mountain of heavy wool and a broken ego. With a grunt of pure, stubborn effort, she dragged him toward the truck. Humanity was a heavy burden, but she refused to let the desert win. The hum of high-voltage fencing was the first thing Jack heard, a rhythmic, predatory buzz that felt like a needle against his brain. He forced his eyes open, but the neon glitz of Seoul was gone. Instead, he was staring at a ceiling of corrugated steel and exposed fiber-optic cables. He tried to bolt upright, but his body screamed, a jagged reminder of the desert's mercy. He wasn't in a hospital. This was a fortress disguised as a farmhouse. Outside the window, rows of genetically modified trees glowed with a faint, bioluminescent hue under the moonlight, their roots fed by automated irrigation lines that snaked through the dark soil like silver veins. This was the Ghost Orchard, a high-tech sanctuary hidden in the folds of the wasteland. Jack looked down at his chest and felt a surge of cold panic. The tailored charcoal suit, his armor of authority, was gone. He was wearing a plain, rough-spun cotton shirt that felt alien against his skin. His gold rings were missing. His encrypted phone was gone. Without the expensive wool and the glint of jewelry, the dragon tattoos on his neck looked less like marks of a king and more like the brands of a prisoner. He was stripped of every visual cue that commanded fear. In this room, he wasn't the Ashen King. He was just a broken man in a stranger's bed. He swung his legs over the side of the mattress, his head spinning as he surveyed the room's tech. Motion sensors blinked in the corners, tracking his every twitch. A heavy iron door slid open and Helen stepped in, her silhouette framed by the blue light of a tablet. She didn't bow. She didn't avert her eyes. She looked at him with the clinical indifference of a mechanic looking at a salvaged engine. The power dynamic had shifted completely. In the city, he held the leash. Here, he was the stray. 300 miles away, the desert's silence was replaced by the deafening roar of a city that never grieves. In the penthouse lounge of the Han River Tower, the air was thick with the scent of ozone and betrayal. Mark Giordani stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows, his reflection ghosting over the neon-soaked skyline of Seoul. He wasn't mourning a mentor, he was carving a carcass. On the mahogany desk behind him lay a stack of digital ledgers, their blue light illuminating the systematic erasure of Jack Chung's legacy. With a single flick of his thumb on a tablet, Mark authorized the liquidation of 3 offshore accounts. The Ashen King's treasury was hemorrhaging, redirected into a new, darker vein of power. The takeover wasn't a boardroom negotiation, it was a call. In the shadows of the loading docks, 2 of Jack's veteran captains were forced to their knees. They didn't beg. They knew the rules of the game they had played for 20 years. Mark didn't even look at them through the live feed on his screen. He simply nodded to a man in a surgical mask. A suppressed click silenced the protest before it could begin. "The old ways are dead weight," Mark whispered, his voice as smooth as the silk tie around his neck. "Loyalty is a liability in a high-frequency world." By midnight, the city's underworld had a new heartbeat. Mark moved through the private clubs like a virus, replacing honor with pure, cold profit. Anyone who hesitated was removed. Anyone who stayed silent was bought. The transition was clinical, efficient, and blood-soaked. As Mark poured a glass of Jack's vintage scotch, he toasted to the empty chair at the head of the table. He didn't just want the throne, he wanted the memory of Jack Chung to be a warning. The predator was feasting, and the city was hungry for more. The peace of the Ghost Orchard was shattered by a sound that didn't belong in the desert, the rhythmic, high-frequency chirping of a thermal mapping drone. Jack was in the kitchen, nursing a mug of lukewarm water when the first proximity alarm wailed. It wasn't a drill. Through the reinforced glass, he saw the bioluminescent canopy ignite, not with growth, but with the white-hot magnesium glare of flashbangs. Mark Giordani hadn't just tracked him, he had sent a liquidation squad. "Get down." Helen screamed, her voice a jagged blade of command. She reached for a submachine gun hidden beneath the floorboards. The kitchen window disintegrated into a billion diamonds of tempered glass as a hail of suppressed gunfire raked the room. Jack rolled behind a steel counter, the heat of a grazing round stinging his cheek. The Ashen King was dead, but the survival instincts of the street kid from Seoul were very much alive. 2 tactical operators breached the perimeter, their movements mechanical and efficient. They weren't there for a conversation. They were cleanup. Helen didn't hesitate. She fired a precise burst, dropping the lead man before his boots even hit the floor. She moved with a kinetic, terrifying grace that Jack realized was born of a military past she had never mentioned. She was a professional in hiding, and her cover had just been blown along with his. "They have the exit blocked," Jack shouted over the roar of the building's self-destruct alarm. He grabbed a heavy iron pipe, the only weapon within reach. The air was thick with the scent of ozone and burning sage. "The tunnel," Helen rasped, her eyes scanning the ceiling as a second drone began a suicide dive toward the roof. "There's a drainage line that leads to the southern gully. If we aren't through it in 60 seconds, we burn with the harvest. A concussive blast rocked the farmhouse, throwing Jack against the wall. The ceiling began to groan, bioluminescent fluids dripping like neon blood from the broken pipes. He looked at Helen, whose face was a mask of cold determination, and realized that his debt had just doubled. She had lost her sanctuary because of his shadow. "Go!" she urged, shoving him toward the trapdoor. They plummeted into the darkness of the irrigation trench just as the farmhouse detonated. The shockwave chased them through the narrow concrete tube, a roaring beast of fire and dust. They emerged a mile away, coughing up silt under the uncaring stars. Behind them, the ghost orchard was a funeral pyre visible for miles. "Seoul is a closed door," Jack wheezed, his lungs burning. Helen looked at her scorched palms, then at the horizon. "We don't go back. We are going to Berlin. I have a contact who owes me a life, and he deals in the kind of ghosts you've become." She didn't wait for his approval. She started walking toward a hidden cache in the rocks. The hunt had moved from the dunes to the world stage. Berlin smelled of cold rain and wet asphalt. For Jack, the transition from the orange desert to the gray, monolithic architecture of Kreuzberg was a sensory assault. They moved through the city like shadows, wearing mismatched clothes from a charity bin in Istanbul. Helen led the way, her posture stiff, her eyes never resting on one spot for more than a second. They weren't just fleeing Mark, they were navigating the invisible web of European intelligence. The safe house was a disused printing press in an alleyway that smelled of diesel. Inside, the air was stagnant, heavy with the dust of 1,000 forgotten books. A man stood at a workbench, his back to them, the blue light of a soldering iron illuminating his skeletal frame. "I told you never to come back, Samuel," the man said without turning. His voice was like sandpaper on silk. "The orchard is gone, Klaus," Helen replied, her hand hovering near her waist. "And I'm bringing a king to your doorstep." Klaus turned, his eyes narrowing as they landed on the dragon tattoos peeking from Jack's collar. He let out a low whistle. "Jack Chung, the man who died in the desert. You're worth enough to buy this entire block, dead or alive." "I am not for sale," Jack rasped. "I need a back door into the Han River network. Mark Giordani didn't just take my chair, he's using my encryption to bypass international banking laws. If I don't stop him, he turns the syndicate into a global virus." Klaus chuckled, a dry, rattling sound. "You want to fight an algorithm with a hammer. This isn't the docks, Jack. Mark has the best hackers money can buy. He's already liquidated your offshore accounts. You're a ghost with zero credit." "Then we go to the source," Helen intervened, leaning over the workbench. "The physical ledger. The cold storage drive Mark keeps in the Frankfurt server farm. If we get that, we don't just stop him, we erase him." Klaus stopped smiling. "Frankfurt, that's a suicide mission. That facility is guarded by former GSG-9. You'll be identified before you even hit the lobby." Jack stepped forward, his eyes reflecting the cold blue light of the workshop. The exhaustion of the desert was gone, replaced by a focused, icy rage. "Then we don't hit the lobby, we hit the foundation." He realized then that he and Helen were no longer a burden and a savior. They were a tactical unit. She provided the shadow and he provided the target. As Klaus began to pull up the blueprints for the Frankfurt facility, the screen flickered. A red notification pinged. "They're right here," Klaus whispered. Outside, the screech of tires echoed through the narrow alley. Mark's reach wasn't just digital. He had hired local muscle to finish what the drones started. Jack grabbed a heavy wrench from the table. "Helen, the back exit. Klaus, if you want to keep your head, start the upload." The city of shadows was about to get loud. Frankfurt's skyline was a jagged crown of glass and steel, a testament to the digital wealth that had replaced the physical world. The server farm was a windowless monolith, encased in 3 feet of reinforced concrete and guarded by a biometric security net that felt like a living organism. Jack and Helen sat in a stolen delivery van 2 blocks away, watching the shift change. 20 seconds, Helen said, her eyes fixed on a tablet Klaus had provided. "When the power grid cycles, the secondary cameras go into a reboot loop. That's our window." She wasn't the woman who had pressed a flask to his lips anymore. She was wearing a tactical vest, her hair pulled back tight, her movements devoid of any hesitation. Jack felt a surge of something he hadn't felt in years, respect. Not the fear-based reverence his captains gave him, but a genuine recognition of a peer. "Why are you doing this, Helen?" Jack asked, his voice low. "You could have stayed in the dunes, you could have let the desert take me." She didn't look at him. The desert doesn't forget, Jack, and neither do I. Mark's people killed my team 5 years ago. I thought I could farm my way out of the trauma. I was wrong. The only way out is through. The lights on the street flickered. Go! They moved with the precision of a high-velocity struggle. Jack took the vent, his body protesting every movement, but the adrenaline acted as a chemical splint. He dropped into the server room, a forest of blinking blue lights and a sub-zero hum. The cold was a physical weight, a stark contrast to the furnace he had died in. He found the cold storage rack, his fingers fumbling with the encrypted lock. "Hurry, Jack!" Helen's voice crackled in his earpiece. "The security team just caught the loop. They're converging on your level." He didn't use a hack. He used the Ashen key, a physical bypass he had kept hidden in a hollowed-out molar for a decade. He jammed the drive into the port. The screen turned blood red. Access granted. Data began to stream millions of dollars, thousands of names, the entire anatomy of Mark's betrayal. But as the progress bar hit 90%, the heavy iron door exploded inward. "Drop it!" a voice boomed. Jack didn't drop the drive. He dove behind a server rack as Lead began to chew through the expensive hardware. The room was filled with the smell of ozone and melting plastic. He was trapped, outgunned, and 3 floors underground. "Jack, I am at the elevator shaft." Helen's voice was strained. "I've got a distraction, but you have to move now." Suddenly, the fire suppression system activated, dumping a thick, opaque foam into the room. In the chaos of the whiteout, Jack lunged for the drive, snatched it from the port, and sprinted for the vent. He emerged into the hallway to find Helen holding off 3 guards with nothing but a tactical baton and a handful of smoke grenades. "Run," she commanded. They hit the stairs, the sound of boots echoing behind them. Frankfurt was no longer a city of banks. It was a maze of steel traps. The drive toward Italy was a blur of high-speed autobahns and narrow alpine passes. They were driving a tuned sedan Klaus had provided, the engine screaming as Jack pushed it toward the limit. In the passenger seat, Helen was stitching a jagged gash in her arm, her face pale but her hands steady. "They won't stop at the border," Jack said, his eyes fixed on the rearview mirror. A black SUV was gaining, its headlights cutting through the mountain fog like predatory eyes. "I know," Helen replied, biting off the thread. "Mark's influence in Italy is deep. He has the port authorities in Genoa. We can't go through the main hubs. We need a way to move the data before they catch us." The SUV surged forward, slamming into their rear bumper. The car fishtailed, the tires shrieking against the wet pavement. Jack fought the wheel, his muscles straining. This wasn't a boardroom negotiation, it was physics and violence. "The drive is encrypted," Jack shouted over the roar of the wind. "Even if they kill us, they can't access it without the final sequence. I need a secure uplink in Milan." "Milan is a death trap," Helen countered. "They'll have every camera in the city mapped to our faces. We go to the coast, the back alleys of Naples." "My old network still breathes there." The SUV rammed them again, harder this time. Jack saw a narrow turnoff, a dirt road that led toward a precipice. He didn't hesitate. He yanked the handbrake, sending the sedan into a controlled slide. The SUV, caught off guard, tried to follow but carried too much momentum. It clipped the guardrail and tumbled into the ravine, a fireball illuminating the dark valley. Jack didn't stop to look. He pushed the car back onto the road, his heart hammering against his ribs. The tension between them was no longer a loaded weapon. It was a shared pulse. They were 2 relics of a violent world, fighting for a future they couldn't quite see. They reached the outskirts of Milan by dawn, the city's cathedral rising like a marble ghost in the mist. They abandoned the car in a canal and moved on foot, their breath coming in ragged bursts. "We need to split the data," Jack said as they ducked into a small cafe. "If they get one of us, they don't get the whole crown." He pulled a second burner phone from his pocket and began the transfer. As the data moved, he looked at Helen. She was staring at a map of the Italian coast, her eyes tired but fierce. "When this is over, Helen," Jack began. "Don't," she interrupted, her voice soft. "Don't talk about after. We're not out of the woods. Mark is still in Seoul, and he has a whole world of mercenaries between us and him. We finish the job, then we talk." He nodded, the weight of his past feeling heavier than ever. The Ashen King had built a throne on blood, but he was starting to realize that the only thing worth holding was the hand of the woman sitting across from him. Naples was a labyrinth of laundry-strewn alleys and the constant, vibrating hum of scooters. It was a city that thrived on secrets, the perfect camouflage for a king and a soldier. They were holed up in a crumbling apartment overlooking the bay, the scent of sea salt and frying garlic drifting through the open window. "The transfer is stalled," Jack muttered, tapping the screen of the laptop. "Mark's team has put a digital firewall around the Genoa servers. They're bottlenecking the data. They know we're here." Helen was cleaning her weapon, the rhythmic click-clack of the metal the only other sound in the room. "They're not just bottlenecking, they're triangulating. Every time we ping the network, we give them a street corner." She stood up and walked to the window, her silhouette framed by the golden Italian light. "We can't stay here, Jack. The neighborhood is too quiet. Someone is watching the street." As if on cue, the hum of a dozen scooters grew louder, converging on their block. It wasn't the police. It was the local Camorra muscle, hired by Mark to do the dirty work. They didn't come with drones. They came with knives and sawed-off shotguns. "Back door," Jack commanded. They scrambled down the rusted fire escape just as the front door was kicked in. The chase was a vertical nightmare, leaping across balconies, sliding down trash chutes, and sprinting through narrow tunnels that smelled of ancient damp. Jack felt a bullet whistle past his ear, the crack of the gunshot echoing off the stone walls. They emerged onto a crowded pier, the tourists unaware of the life-and-death struggle happening in the shadows. Jack saw a high-speed ferry departing for Sicily. "There!" he shouted. They lunged for the moving ramp, Jack catching Helen's hand as she nearly slipped. They pulled themselves onto the deck, breathing hard, as the Camorra thugs stood on the pier, their faces twisted in rage. "We're running out of map, Helen," Jack said, looking back at the receding shoreline. "We're not running," she replied, her eyes fixed on the horizon. "We're repositioning. Mark thinks he's the only one with a global reach. He's forgotten that I spent 10 years in North Africa. We go to Morocco, the dunes where you started." Jack looked at her, the realization hitting him like a physical blow. She wasn't just saving him, she was leading him back to the furnace. "Why there?" "Because in Morocco, the heat strips everything away," she said, her voice a low vibration. "No algorithms. No high-rises. Just us and the man who tried to kill you. We draw him out of his tower and into the grit. That's where you win, Jack, not as a king, as a man." He leaned against the rail, the spray of the Mediterranean cooling his scorched skin. The Ashen King was gone, but the man standing on the deck of the ferry was something far more dangerous. He was a man with nothing left to lose and everything to fight for. Casablanca was a cacophony of white architecture and the rhythmic call to prayer. The air was thick with the scent of spices and ocean spray. Jack and Helen moved through the Medina like ghosts, their faces hidden by traditional robes. They weren't just hiding, they were preparing the final stage of the Ashen Protocol. "The drive is nearly purged," Jack said, his eyes fixed on the screen in a dim back-alley shop. "But I need a physical uplink to the main satellite dish on the edge of the city. If I can't get the signal out, Mark wins by default. He'll bury the evidence and stay on the throne." Helen looked at the map. "The dish is in a military-controlled zone. We can't just walk in, we need a diversion." She looked at Jack, her eyes reflecting a mix of concern and ironclad resolve. "I have a contact in the local resistance. They hate the corporate encroachment as much as we do. For a price, they'll give us the chaos we need." "The price is the data," Jack realized. "You want to give them the keys to the kingdom." "I want to burn the kingdom down, Jack," she countered. "Isn't that what you wanted?" He looked at the dragon tattoos on his wrist, the symbols of a life built on shadows. He realized she was right. The power was the poison. The plan was set for midnight. As the city fell into a restless sleep, the resistance launched a series of coordinated strikes on the city's power stations. The Medina plunged into darkness. In the chaos, Jack and Helen scaled the perimeter fence of the satellite array. The facility was a forest of steel and humming electronics. Jack climbed the central tower, the wind whipping his robes as he fought for a foothold. Below, he could hear the sirens and the frantic shouts of the guards. Helen was at the base, her rifle leveled at the darkness. 5 minutes, Jack," she shouted. He reached the main terminal, his fingers dancing over the keys. The signal bar flickered 1 bar, 2, then a solid green. Uploading, the progress bar moved with agonizing slowness. 10%, 20. Suddenly, a red laser dot appeared on the terminal. A sniper was on the adjacent tower. "Get down!" Helen's voice was a scream. A shot rang out, shattering the terminal casing. Jack felt a searing pain in his shoulder, but he didn't move. He held the drive in place, his blood dripping onto the electronics. 40%, 50. The sniper fired again, the bullet grazing Jack's ribs. He slumped against the tower, his vision blurring. He saw Helen return fire, the flash of her muzzle illuminating the night. She was a whirlwind of violence, protecting him from a world that wanted him dead. "Come on," he wheezed. The bar hit 100%. Transmission complete. Across the world, Mark Giordani's accounts were freezing. His name was being added to every watch list on the planet. The Ashen King had just fired the final shot. But as Jack slid down the tower, he saw a convoy of black SUVs tearing through the gates. Mark hadn't sent mercenaries this time. He was in the lead car. The Predator had finally come to the dunes to finish the job himself. The desert night was a velvet curtain of black and silver. Jack and Helen were in a stolen Jeep, the engine roaring as they pushed south toward the Atlas Mountains. Behind them, the headlights of Mark's convoy were a persistent, predatory glow. "He's desperate," Helen said, her hand on the dashboard as they bounced over the uneven terrain. "He's lost everything digital. Now he's coming for the only thing he has left, your head." "Then we give him what he wants," Jack rasped, his shoulder bandaged but still bleeding. "We lead him into the deep dunes, the empty quarter, no roads, no support, just the heat and the sand." They drove for hours, the moon casting long, distorted shadows across the dunes. The landscape was beautiful and terrifying, a vast, uncaring void that had swallowed better men than them. Jack felt a strange sense of peace. He was back where he started, but this time he wasn't alone. They reached a narrow canyon, the walls rising like jagged teeth on either side. Jack cut the engine and the lights. The silence was absolute, broken only by the ticking of the cooling metal. "He's here," Helen whispered, her shotgun leveled at the entrance. 3 SUVs entered the canyon, their floodlights blindingly white. Mark Giordani stepped out of the center vehicle, his silk suit covered in dust, his face a mask of panicked rage. He held a tactical carbine like a man who didn't know how to use it. "Jack," Mark's voice echoed off the canyon walls. "Show yourself. You think you've won? I'll buy the world back with your blood." Jack stepped into the light, his robes tattered, his eyes cold. He didn't have a gun. He had a flared signal torch. "The world is gone, Mark," Jack said, his voice a low vibration. "The Ashen Protocol didn't just freeze your accounts. It revealed every murder, every bribe, and every betrayal. You're not a businessman anymore, you're a fugitive." Mark laughed, a high-pitched, desperate sound. "You think these people care about the truth? They care about the money, and I still have enough to kill you 10 times over." He raised the carbine, his finger tightening on the trigger. But before he could fire, Helen stepped out from the shadows, her shotgun aimed at the fuel tank of the lead SUV. "Drop it, Mark," she commanded. Mark looked from Jack to Helen, his eyes darting like a trapped animal. He realized he was outmatched, not by technology, but by the grit of 2 people who had survived the worst he could throw at them. You're nothing without the city," Mark spat. "The city was a cage, Mark," Jack replied. "This is the world." Suddenly, Mark's men began to lower their weapons. They were mercenaries, and they knew when a paycheck had dried up. They looked at the flickering signal torch in Jack's hand and realized the game was over. They backed away, leaving Mark alone in the circle of light. The king was officially dethroned. Mark Giordani stood alone in the center of the canyon, the dust of the Sahara swirling around his polished shoes. He looked at his men, the professionals he had bought with Jack's stolen wealth, as they climbed back into the SUVs and reversed out of the canyon. They didn't look back. In the world of high-frequency betrayal, a bankrupt boss was a liability. "Come on, then," Mark screamed, swinging the carbine wildly. "Do it! Kill me! End the legend!" Jack walked toward him, his footsteps heavy in the sand. He didn't look like a king. He looked like a man who had walked through hell and found the exit. He stopped 3 feet away, the barrel of Mark's gun shaking against his chest. "I am not going to kill you, Mark," Jack said, his voice calm. "That would be an act of mercy, and I've run out of that." He reached out and snatched the carbine from Mark's trembling hands. Mark fell to his knees, his face buried in his hands, weeping with the realization of his total failure. He had the throne, the money, and the power, and he had lost it all to a ghost and a farmer. "You left me to be digested by the dunes," Jack reminded him, his voice like cold iron. "Now the world will do the same to you. The authorities are already at the entrance of the canyon. They don't want the money, Mark. They want the monster." In the distance, the low hum of military helicopters grew louder, their searchlights sweeping the desert floor. The Moroccan authorities, alerted by the data leak, were closing in. Mark would spend the rest of his life in a concrete box, his name a footnote in a history of violence. Helen walked up to Jack, her hand resting on his uninjured shoulder. She looked at the kneeling, broken man and then at the sky. "It's over, Jack. The shadow is gone." Jack looked at her, and the last of the Ashen King finally dissolved. He felt the weight of the crown lift, replaced by a lightness he hadn't known since he was a child. He turned his back on Mark and the approaching sirens. "Let's go," he said. They walked back to their jeep, the desert wind blowing the dust from their clothes. They drove away from the canyon, the lights of the helicopters fading into the distance. They weren't fugitives anymore. They were just two people driving toward a sunrise that actually meant something. As the sky began to turn a soft, bruised purple, Jack reached across the seat and took Helen's hand. Her grip was firm, a reminder of the life they had fought for. "We need a new name," Jack said, a faint smile on his lips. "No," Helen replied, her eyes on the road. "We don't need names at all, we just need to be." They drove into the dawn, leaving the ruins of an empire behind them. The Sahara was vast, uncaring, and beautiful, the perfect place for a ghost to find a soul. The hunt was over. Life was beginning. He felt the cold spray of the air on his face, and for the first time it didn't feel like a threat. It felt like a baptism. The king was dead. Long live the man. The Atlantic coast of Morocco was a world away from the neon glare of Seoul or the cold steel of Frankfurt. Here, the soil was red, the air was sweet with the scent of argan trees, and the only clock was the sun. 6 months had passed. Jack stood in the center of a small, thriving orchard tucked into a valley in the Atlas Mountains. He wasn't wearing a $10,000 suit. He was wearing rough linen trousers and a sun-bleached shirt. His hands were calloused, his skin a deep, healthy bronze. He was holding a pruning hook, his eyes fixed on a cluster of young trees that were finally starting to bear fruit. "They're a-growing, Jack," a voice said behind him. He turned to see Helen. She was wearing a simple dress, her hair long and free, her face devoid of the tension that had defined her for years. She looked beautiful. She looked real. She was carrying a basket of fresh bread and a jar of local honey. "The soil is honest here," Jack said, repeating the words that had become their mantra. She walked up to him and rested her head on his shoulder. They stood together, looking out over the valley. The Ashen Protocol was a memory, a digital ghost story that people still whispered about in the dark corners of the internet. Mark Giordani was a prisoner in a high-security facility, and the syndicate had been dismantled, its assets redirected to the victims of its violence. "Do you ever miss the noise?" Helen asked, her voice soft. Jack looked at his wrist. The dragon tattoos were still there, but they had faded under the relentless Moroccan sun. They were no longer brands of power. They were scars of a life lived and survived. "The only noise I want to hear is the wind in these trees," Jack replied. He turned her toward him and kissed her. It was a kiss that tasted of honey and peace, a cathartic end to a journey that had started in a desert furnace. They weren't a king and a soldier anymore. They were two people who had found their humanity in the wreckage of an empire. As the sun began to set, painting the mountains in shades of gold and violet, they walked back toward their small, whitewashed house. The ghost orchard had been a fortress, but this was a home. They had traded the world for a single, honest life, and to them, the trade was the greatest victory of all. The Ashen King was officially dead. In his place walked a man with a clean heart and a woman who loved him. They disappeared into the shadows of the trees, two ghosts who had finally decided to live. Thanks for watching this episode of Dominus Tales. We're building a library of cinematic stories just like this one. If you want to support the channel, hit the like button and subscribe to stay notified of our weekly releases. Don't forget to drop a comment with your theories on what happens next. Your engagement helps us keep the Tales alive.